Preserved in the flickering images of the films shot by some of Britain's farmers is a unique record of the influences that drove a 20th century revolution on the land. A revolution that left no area of farming unchanged.
By 1978, Britain was self-sufficient in temperate foodstuffs. We hadn't been self-sufficient since the 1760s. That is an extraordinary achievement.
Why did farming go from this to this? How did we go from milk delivered by the milkman to an industry dominated by supermarkets? And why today are there so few family farms left?
When my grandfather came here 100 years ago, there were probably 26 dairies supplying milk into the Swindon market. And now we're the last one.
Told through the home movies and voices of the farmers who both led the changes and who were at the sharp end of them, the programmes in this series tell the story of the revolution in the four pillars of Britain's food production: wheat, horticulture, meat and milk. Milk is a huge industry. Britain's farmers produce around 13 billion litres of milk every year. Ever since we began to recognise that milk was good for our health, the daily pinter has been part of our diet and our culture. And milk is hugely important for Britain's farmers. Milk takes a larger share of farm profits than any other product. But the way it's produced and sold, and even the product itself, has changed dramatically. In the 1920s, there were 150,000 farmers producing milk. Most of it was sold door to door. Today, nearly all of the milk we drink is produced from specialist cows. It's treated in large-scale processing plants, and 90% of it is sold by supermarkets. And the number of dairy farmers has shrunk to 15,000.
Come on, Sumo. Come on, you old devil. Come on.
Will Hosford is a dairy farmer in North Dorset.
It's a semi-tame cow, unfortunately, so it's a bit of a friend.
Will grew up on the farm with his two brothers. This is him as a toddler. He's on the left. And here he is at 4 years old, herding cows in the same red pullover.
Growing up on this farm, I think was good fun, great fun, really. At quite a young age, we were always out doing something on the farm.
Excuse me, come on.
Nick Gosling farms a herd of Guernsey dairy cows in North Wiltshire. Like Will, Nick grew up on the farm. This is him as a 5-year-old.
To go out with Dad was a thrill. I used to ride around with him everywhere. I was just his apprentice, really.
This is his wife, Christine. They married in 1981.
And as soon as we were married, I was taught to milk and looked after the calves. I fell in love with this farm.
Will Hosford and Nick Gosling's home movies and family histories reveal the scale of the milk revolution and why, when most dairy farmers have given up, they are carrying on.
Steady up now. Woo woo.
How are you doing? How are you? How's that foot? How's that foot? I know.
Well, we have about 90 in the herd, but of course it goes up and down. There you go. We've got Guernseys. We've always had Guernseys because we love the colour of the milk, and it's such a quality milk. It goes on to make the fantastic butter and cream. Well, the sugars are the highest in the grass now for about the next hour. And then as soon as the sun starts to go down, the sugars disappear, and there's not so much goodness in the grass. So we let them out for a quick bite now, and then before it gets too cold tonight, because they're talking about the frost, we'll have them back in. They'll be back on their straw. I'm in charge of the arable side of the farm and the producing of the food for the cows. And I'm working round the herd, and then the centre core of the herd, the actual milking, is performed by Chris, my wife.
Come on, it's all right. Good girl. Up you go. Up you go. Come on. Up, 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 up. I've been doing this since I married Nick, which was 25 years ago. I start at 5 o'clock in the morning, and then again at 3:30 in the afternoon. And it's a very physical job.
These scenes of life at Berkeley Farm were filled by Nick Gosling's mother. She bought her first camera just after the war, and then carried on filming for almost 40 years.
Once she got her cine film, she got the bug, and we could do nothing without a cine film being stuck in our face. Mum, who never went near the farm except to get us picnics and bring out stuff out to the combine, but she always liked to be on film on the farm. So that was our very first combine, with Dad and Uncle Toby driving. But it was so exciting. When the combine got going, everyone used to rush out to watch the combine.
The Gosling story begins at the start of the last century.
Grandfather moved to Artist Farm, which is the next one down, which was a rented farm, and he came there in 1908. And he was just a small 60, 70 acre farm with a few cows, and he gradually built up the herd, and then decided in about 1919 he'd start delivering milk locally to the village.
And Nick's grandfather wasn't alone.
A sensible farmer would give up growing wheat, particularly mixed farming on bad wheat lands, and move into dairying. The reason is quite simple. There is a growing and continually growing demand for dairy product, fresh milk, butter, cheese, but also industry and commercial use of dairying.
Most of these farmers sold their milk to a milk processor. By the late 1920s, these processors were able to use their economic power to drive down the price of milk they paid to farmers, and many farmers struggled to survive. But in 1934, the government stepped in. It created an organisation that bought all the milk produced by farmers and then sold it on their behalf to the processors. It was called the Milk Marketing Board, and it gave economic power to the dairy farmer.
As a result of the guaranteed price, I don't think there's much doubt that more people went into dairying.
One of the many people excited by the new opportunities that were opening up in agriculture in the 1930s was David Hosford.
When we were little boys, my father was very keen on the countryside and all the rest of it. And when it came to leave school, what was I going to do? Well, I was going farming.
I think I'm going to need a hand to push this over, Pavel.
It's his son, Will, who now runs the family farm.
No use trying to do the filming and the work at the same time, because you lose the camera and the straw.
But he does record what's going on the farm. He likes to keep a record. And it's quite interesting to look at the pictures from years gone by.
Well, I was brought up in London, in Highgate, where my father was a GP, but the countryside was always very important. He was keen on the countryside. He was a bit of a naturalist. And when we purchased this cottage in Whipsnade, country life became part of our life.
That's David in 1938, driving the cart with his younger brother and sister.
We got to know this farm, Church Farm Whipsnade, and the family, Bates, the farmers, very well. And extraordinarily enough, they used to welcome us. We were visitors that they liked to see. We weren't muddling urbanites. And I can remember I said to my father, "Go and ask him if there's something we can do." And I was about 9 or 10 then. I would be given something or other to do. And I suppose because I showed some keenness, gradually we were allowed to lead the horses, and I suppose we really, the family, got really keen on farming.
And this is the three of them on the farm wearing air raid helmets, 2 years after the outbreak of World War II.
Through the war, we weren't evacuated to the cottage in the war. We lived in London, but we spent quite a lot of time at the cottage. It was only within an hour's run from home. And we really got dug in at that farm.
The war had a profound impact on most areas of agricultural output, but not milk production.
The Second World War ought to have damaged the fortunes of dairy farmers in some ways. The concentration on the production of the staple, i.e. wheat, did certainly take a good deal of pasture out of production, and certainly the number of cattle fell during the war. They didn't fall as much as they might have done, for the simple reason that in the 1930s, particularly, people had become aware of the science of diet, and in that, milk acquired a particular place as essential for kids in particular. And it's during the war that you get the introduction of school milk. Now, the purpose of school milk is to ensure that children get a certain amount of calcium in their diet and so on. So that actually kind of protects dairying to an extent during the war.
War ended in 1945, but Britain continued to face food shortages and rationing, and a balance of payments crisis meant the country didn't have the money to import food. So, to encourage domestic production, the government took a fundamental decision. It decided to continue to pay financial subsidies to farmers. The approach was enshrined in the 1947 Agriculture Act.
The Agriculture Act of 1947 is, without doubt, the most important piece of agricultural legislation passed in the 20th century. Absolutely no doubt at all. At some very basic level, it saved British farming.
Under the Act, dairy farmers were to be given a guaranteed price for all the milk they could produce. It amounted to an open invitation to increase output, and it led to a revolution in every aspect of dairy production. It was already happening when David Hosford moved onto his farm in Dorset in 1952.
What, since the 50s?
Yeah, well, the first film I remember is a calf in front of my father's house, old Dad's house.
Yeah.
And that must have been within about 6 months of taking over the farm in 1952.
I'm not sure I can remember that.
No, you were just a twinkle in my eye in those days.
Yes.
Age 55, my father said, "I'm going to retire and we will look for a farm," which was very exciting. We bought the farm and we moved in, and that was in September 1952. And we've been here ever since.
The Hosfords had bought a classic mixed farm. They had a little of everything.
Well, we took over lock, stock and barrel, which means we took all the machinery and all the livestock. And the livestock consisted of 4 nurse cows. We had 2 sows and about 200 hens. Fairly soon, we pushed along into dairying, although probably for 10 years we grew some grain. The cows became more important, and you couldn't have both. There wasn't room for both. We hadn't got the acreage. We didn't set the trend. The trend was to specialise.
As the system of price guarantees was introduced following the 47 Act, David realised that if they were going to maximise their output and profits, they would need to become specialist producers. In Wiltshire, the Goslings mixed farm was moving in the same direction.
Chris went to work when we first got married for a neighbouring farmer to help him do his lambing, and came back with lambs that grew into sheep and then had lambs, and they were forever getting out. And those animals were more of a nuisance than 100 cows. They drove me mad. We really had to specialise more. And there wasn't the profit in all those enterprises unless you were very efficient. So to specialise, you had to then put all your energies into one type of farming. Chickens, on the scale we had them, weren't cost effective, and the pigs the same.
Because the economies of scale were driving the system, it was becoming more and more important for small farms to specialise in one activity rather than a variety of activities. A few hens, a few pigs, a few cows didn't make commercial sense. But it was also part of the guarantees that government was giving. Historically, one of the reasons for mixed farming is because you've got various eggs in various baskets. But if everything was guaranteed, you didn't need that same diversification of risk to the same extent as you did before.
But the revolution in dairy farming went well beyond specialisation. Farmers were beginning to realise that because there was a guaranteed market for all they could produce, they had a huge financial incentive to increase their output.
In agriculture, you can only increase production in 2 ways: extensively or intensively. Extensively means bringing more land, in inverted commas, into cultivation. Well, in dairying, this means simply having more cows. The problem is that the land which you can keep cows on is not infinite. So therefore, the most sensible way to increase production, and the way which is dominant in the post-war era in Britain, is by intensively farming what you've got. In other words, in the case of cows, increasing the yield per animal of milk.
An MMB Regional Livestock Royal Show judge.
Dairy farmers set about intensifying production in broadly 3 ways. They embraced genetics to develop new breeds of cow, science to alter its diet, and technology to make milking more efficient.
In the milk by infrared analysis.
This is the Herringbone milking parlour at Will Hosford's Dorset dairy farm. A herdsman and an assistant milk the herd of 300 cows twice a day, every day of the year. During the 1930s, as David Hosford remembers, it was very different.
To start off with, you were doing it by hand, and then you had a portable milking machine which you took from cow to cow. Well, just imagine 150 cows there and 150 down here. You'd walk a very long way. In 1952, we bought a bale, and a bale is a mobile contraption which you drag across the fields. We were pretty green. I hadn't had much experience of. I knew about horses, which perhaps didn't serve us very well, but I didn't know much about dairying. However, we got the cows to go through the milking bale.
Then in 1963, he was the first farmer in the area to install a herringbone milking parlour. He'd seen them in action on a study tour of Australia and New Zealand.
I remember in Australia, driving with a journalist in a very tatty train in Victoria, the state of Victoria, going north to the irrigation areas. And we were going there, he was going as a journalist, and we were travelling together. And I said, he said, what do you want to see? Dive. And I said, I really want to see how one man can look after 100 cows. Oh, God, we'll see plenty of that. And it was remarkable. When we got to this irrigation area, there were lots and lots of herds being run very efficiently by the farmer, with really little labour input from anything else. The Herringbone milking parlour was a big step forward in cutting down the labour and milking cows efficiently.
By the 1980s, David Hosford's once revolutionary milking parlour had been adopted by most dairy farmers. Today, that technology is itself being replaced by systems that can milk 70 cows without any labour. Once these cows have been trained, they can be milked by computer-automated machines and rarely see a herdsman. But it was not just the way cows were milked, it was the way they were fed that changed radically after the war.